A morning of frustration and bias. The sun cast its golden rays over the city, illuminating streets that bustled with life. Officer Sebastian's patrol car cruised through neighborhoods he knew well, or thought he did. His hands clenched the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. The morning had been relentless, back-to-back calls, heated confrontations, and endless paperwork. He felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, each situation pressing down on him until he could hardly breathe. Sebastian sighed heavily. Just a few more hours, he muttered under his breath, and I can finally go home. Home, where silence and routine awaited him. But even there, the nagging frustrations of his job crept in, uninvited. For over 20 years, Sebastian had served the force with pride, or at least he had tried to. Lately, though, everything seemed to be slipping away from him. He couldn't ignore the changes that came with time. It wasn't just the newer, more diverse recruits who challenged the old ways of policing, it was the public too. Everyone had an opinion now, and it wasn't often kind. The respect he once commanded as an officer seemed to dwindle with each passing year. Back in my day, people respected the badge. Sebastian fought bitterly as he stopped at a red light. Now, it felt like all eyes were on him, suspicious, distrusting. He shook his head and pressed the gas pedal when the light turned green, his thoughts swirling in a toxic mixture of self-pity and resentment. Sebastian's patrol took him to a part of town that always set his teeth on edge, a predominantly black neighborhood filled with vibrant murals, children playing on sidewalks, and elders chatting on porches. It wasn't the people themselves that made him uneasy. It was the stories he told himself about them over the years. This area, he believed, was a hotbed for crime, even though statistics said otherwise. The fear wasn't rooted in reality, it was rooted in his bias, the kind that sensitivity training and lectures had failed to erode. As he rolled through the streets, his eyes scanned every corner, every shadow. He saw a group of young men laughing on a stoop, and his fingers twitched toward the holster on his belt. Probably up to no good, he thought reflexively. He shook his head, trying to dispel the creeping sense of guilt that followed the thought. No, he told himself, I'm not biased. I just know this neighborhood too well. He turned onto a quieter street lined with trees, their branches casting dappled shadows across the pavement. Ahead, he spotted a small figure sitting on the curb near the park. It was a little girl, no older than 5, playing with a tattered doll. Her dark curls framed her face as she hummed softly to herself, lost in her own world. Sebastian's jaw tightened. What's a kid that young doing out here alone? He muttered, already making assumptions. His mind raced through a litany of worst-case scenarios. Neglect, abandonment, danger. Without hesitation, he pulled his car to the side of the road and stepped out, his boots striking the pavement with purpose. Hey, he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The little girl looked up, startled. Her big brown eyes locked onto him, wide with fear. She clutched her doll tighter, as if it might shield her from whatever was coming next. Sebastian marched toward her, his expression stern. "Where are your parents?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended. The girl's lips quivered as she tried to answer, but no words came. Instead, tears began to pool in her eyes, threatening to spill over. I, she stammered, her small voice barely audible. Before she could finish, Sebastian cut her off. "Speak up," he snapped, frustration leaking into his tone. "You shouldn't be out here alone. Where's your mom or dad?" The girl shrank under his towering presence, her tiny frame trembling. She clutched her doll so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her lower lip trembled as she tried to muster the courage to answer. Sebastian sighed impatiently, his frustration mounting. "What's your name? Where do you live?" he demanded, his voice rising with each question. The girl didn't answer. Instead, a single tear slipped down her cheek, tracing a path through the dust on her face. Around them, the neighborhood began to stir. People peeked out of their windows and stepped onto their porches, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the uniformed officer towering over the small child. Among them was Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who had lived on this street for decades. She recognized the girl instantly. "Officer," Mrs. Johnson called out as she hobbled over with her cane. "That's Mia. Her daddy's just around the corner." Sebastian turned to face the woman, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, please step back. This is police business," he said curtly, his voice brooking no argument. "But she's not alone," Mrs. Johnson insisted, her voice trembling with concern. "Her father works at the community center. He's a good man. He's probably nearby." Sebastian ignored her, his attention snapping back to Mia. He reached for his radio, ready to call for backup. "If you won't tell me where your parents are," he said to the girl, "then I'm taking you to the station until we figure this out." Mia's eyes filled with fresh tears, her small body racked with silent sobs. The crowd that had begun to gather murmured in disapproval, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. "She's just a child," someone shouted. "You can't treat her like this," added another. Sebastian's patience snapped. He reached down and grabbed Mia's arm, his grip firm but not gentle. "Come on," he growled, pulling her toward his patrol car. "We'll sort this out at the station." Mia cried out, her voice high and piercing. "Daddy, I want my daddy," she wailed, her cries echoing down the street. The crowd erupted in outrage. Phones were pulled out, cameras recording every moment. Voices shouted over one another, demanding that Sebastian let the girl go. "Let her go," Mrs. Johnson cried, her frail voice shaking with emotion. "You're hurting her." Sebastian's jaw clenched as he tightened his grip on Mia, his mind a whirlwind of anger, frustration, and doubt. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control of the situation, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He opened the back door of his patrol car and placed Mia inside, her cries muffled by the thick glass. As he turned back to the crowd, he saw their faces, angry, disbelieving, and accusing. Phones were still recording, their lenses capturing every detail of the unfolding drama. Sebastian climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the sound of the car's rumble barely drowning out the shouts from the crowd. As he drove away, Mia's sobs filled the car, each one a dagger to his already frayed nerves. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Had he done the right thing? Or had he let his frustration and bias cloud his judgment? Little did Sebastian know, the events of the next 10 minutes would change his life forever. The storm unfolds. Sebastian drove through the streets in silence, the muffled cries of little Mia echoing through the patrol car. The sound was gut-wrenching, but he forced himself to focus on the road, his mind rationalizing his actions. "I did what I had to do," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow even to him. He glanced at Mia through the rearview mirror. Her tear-streaked face, flushed with fear, stared out the window as she clutched her doll, now missing one of its arms after the commotion. Her quiet sobs pulled at something deep within him, but Sebastian quickly buried the feeling. Protocol, he reminded himself. This is about her safety. Yet a nagging doubt began to creep in, its presence growing stronger with every passing moment. As he approached the station, his phone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat. Notifications from social media, texts from colleagues, and updates from the precinct flooded his screen. He ignored them for now, pulling into the station parking lot and turning off the engine with a shaky hand. He stepped out of the car and opened the back door, reaching for Mia. The little girl recoiled, her body pressed as far back into the seat as it could go. "It's okay," Sebastian said, trying to soften his tone, but the words sounded foreign and stiff. "We just need to find your parents." He extended his hand, but Mia flinched, clutching her doll tighter. Her wide, terrified eyes pierced through his composure. A deep pang of regret struck him, but Sebastian quickly masked it with frustration. "Come on," he said more firmly, lifting her out of the car despite her resistance. As he carried her into the station, her cries grew louder, drawing the attention of his colleagues and even some civilians who were seated in the lobby. The atmosphere in the station shifted immediately. Conversations hushed, and heads turned towards Sebastian as he walked in with a crying child. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, and a few people pulled out their phones to discreetly record the scene. At the front desk, Officer Willow looked up, his eyes widening at the sight before him. "Sebastian," he began, his voice tinged with confusion. "What's going on here?" "I found her alone at the park," Sebastian replied curtly, placing Mia on a chair by the desk. She huddled there, her small frame trembling as she tried to make herself invisible. "No parents in sight. I'm bringing her in for her safety." Willow's brow furrowed as he glanced at Mia, then back at Sebastian. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "She's just a kid. Maybe she lives close by. Did you ask around?" Sebastian bristled. "I did what I could," he snapped. "This neighborhood isn't exactly known for—" He stopped himself, realizing too late that he was about to say something he shouldn't. "Look, I'm following procedure," he finished instead, his tone defensive. Willow didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, pulling out some forms. "Let's start the paperwork." As Sebastian began filling out the necessary documents, the tension in the room grew palpable. Mia's soft sobs filled the air, each one chipping away at the justification Sebastian had built for himself. Every so often he glanced at her, and each time he felt a stab of discomfort. She looked so small, so vulnerable. Was this really the best way to protect her? Before he could dwell on the thought, the station doors burst open with a loud bang, causing everyone to turn their heads. Standing in the doorway was a tall, imposing man with broad shoulders and a face etched with fury. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Mia, and his expression shifted from anger to relief. "Daddy!" Mia cried, scrambling off the chair and running toward him. The man knelt down, scooping her up in his arms as she buried her face in his neck. He held her tightly, his large hands cradling her protectively as if shielding her from the world. Sebastian's stomach dropped. He recognized the man instantly, Ben Carter, a respected community leader who ran the local youth center. Ben was well known in the area, not just for his work, but for his calm, level-headed demeanor. But today, there was nothing calm about him. His eyes, now fixed on Sebastian, burned with barely contained anger. "What the hell is going on here?" Ben demanded, his voice steady but filled with an edge that could cut steel. He approached the desk, his every step measured and deliberate, with Mia still clinging to him. Sebastian tried to muster his authority. "Mr. Carter," he began, "I found your daughter alone at the park. She was unattended, and I—" "Unattended," Ben interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "She was playing where she always plays, 100 feet from our home. I was around the corner at the community center, helping some kids. She wasn't in danger, and you know it." Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, but Ben didn't give him the chance. "You didn't see a lost child," he said, his voice sharp and accusing. "You saw a black child, and instead of asking questions, you jumped to conclusions and escalated the situation. My daughter is terrified because of you." The weight of Ben's words hit Sebastian like a freight train, but he struggled to maintain his composure. "I was following protocol," he said weakly, though even he didn't believe it anymore. Ben took a step closer, his presence commanding the room. "Protocol?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Does protocol include handcuffing a 5-year-old? Does protocol include ignoring the pleas of an entire community trying to tell you that you were wrong?" The room was silent, all eyes on the two men. Sebastian could feel the judgment in their gazes, the unspoken accusations. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of what he had done. Before he could respond, Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "You need to see this," he said, holding it out to Sebastian. The officer hesitated, but eventually took the device. On the screen was a video, recorded by one of the bystanders at the park. Sebastian watched in silence as the events replayed before him. The video showed him approaching Mia, his posture aggressive and his tone harsh. It showed him grabbing her arm and dragging her toward the car, ignoring her cries and the pleas of the onlookers. It showed the fear in her eyes, the way she clutched her doll as if it were her only lifeline. By the time the video ended, Sebastian's hands were trembling. He looked up at Ben, who was staring at him with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Do you see now?" Ben asked, his voice softer but no less firm. "Do you see what you did to my daughter, to my community?" Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his career, he felt truly lost. The justification he had clung to so tightly now felt like a flimsy shield, crumbling under the weight of his actions. Before he could gather his thoughts, the station door opened again, and a swarm of reporters flooded in, cameras flashing and microphones extended. The video had already gone viral, and the media had descended upon the station like vultures. Sebastian's heart sank as he realized there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. The storm he had created was just beginning, and it was about to consume everything he had worked for. A reckoning in the spotlight. The flash of cameras was blinding. Reporters jostled for position in the lobby, their voices a cacophony of demands and accusations. The air inside the station was suffocating, thick with tension and judgment. Sebastian stood frozen, his badge feeling heavier than ever on his chest. His world, carefully constructed over 2 decades of service, was crumbling around him, and there was no way to stop it. "Officer Sebastian," one journalist shouted over the noise, shoving a microphone toward him. "What do you have to say about the viral video? Do you believe your actions were justified?" Another voice cut in, sharper and more pointed. "Are you aware of the racial implications of your behavior? Do you think this reflects systemic bias in law enforcement?" Sebastian's lips parted, but no words came. His throat was dry, his mind spinning as he searched for a response, any response that could salvage what was left of his reputation. But the reporters didn't wait for him to answer. They pressed on, their questions growing more aggressive. "Do you regret handcuffing a child? Will you issue an apology to the family? How do you respond to calls for your resignation?" Behind him, he felt the weight of his colleagues' stares. Some looked sympathetic, others disappointed, and a few openly disapproving. Even Officer Willow, who had tried to support him earlier, now avoided eye contact. The divide in the room was palpable, and Sebastian was at the center of it. Across the lobby, Ben Carter stood with Mia still clinging to him, her small hands gripping his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He held her protectively, his broad shoulders shielding her from the cameras and chaos. His face, however, was unyielding, a mixture of righteous anger and determination. "Enough." The commanding officer's voice boomed through the station, cutting through the noise like a knife. Chief Donovan, a seasoned lawman with decades of experience, strode into the room with a grim expression. His presence commanded silence, and the reporters fell back slightly, though their cameras continued to roll. "Officer Sebastian," Chief Donovan said, his voice low and firm, "in my office. Now." Sebastian hesitated, glancing at Ben, then at the reporters, before nodding stiffly and following the chief down the hallway. The stares of his colleagues burned into his back as he walked, their unspoken judgment echoing louder than any words. The office door closed behind them with a heavy thud, muffling the chaos outside. Chief Donovan stood by his desk, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He didn't sit down, nor did he gesture for Sebastian to do so. Instead, he stared at the younger officer, his eyes filled with disappointment. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Donovan asked, his voice steady but loaded with controlled anger. "Do you understand the fallout we're facing because of your actions?" Sebastian swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "I was following protocol, sir," he said weakly, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. "Protocol," Donovan repeated, his voice rising slightly. Does protocol include traumatizing a child, ignoring the community, and escalating a situation that never should have been a situation in the first place? You've put this entire department under a microscope, Sebastian. The video is everywhere. The media is tearing us apart, and the public trust we've worked so hard to build is hanging by a thread. Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, but Donovan held up a hand to stop him. "Save it," he said curtly. "The excuses don't matter now. What matters is the damage you've done to that little girl, to her family, and to this community. And let me be clear, you will be held accountable." The words hit Sebastian like a blow. He had known there would be consequences, but hearing them spelled out so plainly was a different kind of pain. His career, his identity, everything he had built over the past 20 years was unraveling before his eyes. "I'm suspending you," Donovan said, his tone final. "Effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Turn in your badge and your weapon." Sebastian's stomach sank. "Sir, please," he began, desperation creeping into his voice. "Now," Donovan snapped, cutting him off. His face softened for a moment, but his voice remained firm. "Sebastian, you need to take a long, hard look at yourself. This isn't just about one bad decision. This is about the way you see the people you're supposed to serve. Until you can confront that, you have no business wearing this badge." Reluctantly, Sebastian reached for his badge and unholstered his gun, placing them both on Donovan's desk. The weight of their absence was immediate, a tangible reminder of everything he was losing. He turned and left the office without another word, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped. When he stepped back into the lobby, the reporters pounced again, their questions coming faster and more furious. But Sebastian didn't stop to answer them. He kept his head down and walked out the front doors, the cool air hitting him like a slap to the face. Outside, the scene was no better. Protesters had gathered on the steps of the station, their signs and chants a stark condemnation of his actions. "Justice for Mia," they shouted. "Hold him accountable." Sebastian pushed through the crowd, their angry faces blurring together as he made his way to his car. He felt hollow, the noise around him fading into a dull roar as he drove away from the station. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, but this time there was no control in his grip, only fear, regret, and a growing sense of self-loathing. Meanwhile, back at the station, Ben Carter was speaking to reporters. His voice was calm but resolute, each word carefully chosen. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said, his hand resting gently on Mia's shoulder. "This is about every child, every family, and every community that has been judged unfairly or treated unjustly. We deserve better. Our children deserve better." The crowd murmured in agreement, and cameras flashed as Ben continued. "We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for fairness, for dignity, and for accountability. Today, we take a stand, not just for Mia, but for all of us." As Ben spoke, Mia looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with a mixture of awe and comfort. Her father's strength and resolve were a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there could be a path toward healing. But for Sebastian, that path felt impossibly far away. Alone in his apartment later that night, he sat in silence, replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. Every shout, every tear, every moment of doubt and regret haunted him. He had thought of himself as one of the good guys, someone who upheld the law and protected the innocent. Now he wasn't so sure. The viral video played on the news, the images of his actions laid bare for the world to see. His phone buzzed with messages, some from colleagues, others from friends or family. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he stared at the screen, the faces of Mia and Ben burned into his memory. For the first time in his career, Sebastian felt the full weight of what it meant to be wrong. Not just wrong in action, but wrong in perception, in judgment, in heart. And as the city continued to react to the storm he had unleashed, he realized that the journey ahead would be the hardest one he had ever faced. The aftermath and the ripple effect. Sebastian sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the television flickering in the background. Every news station seemed to be covering the story. His face, once a badge of authority and pride, was now a symbol of controversy and division. Headlines flashed across the screen. Viral video sparks outrage. Officer arrests 5-year-old girl in community uproar. Calls for justice. Is this proof of racial bias in policing? Heartbroken father speaks out against injustice. Sebastian muted the TV, unable to bear the sound of the commentators dissecting his actions any longer. The silence that followed was almost worse. It was heavy and suffocating, amplifying the racing thoughts in his head. He leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. The images haunted him: Mia's terrified eyes, Ben's furious but composed face, the crowd shouting at him, and the reporters flashing their cameras. He had tried to rationalize his decisions, clinging to protocol and procedure as a shield. But now those justifications felt paper-thin. Deep down, he couldn't deny the truth. He had let his own biases dictate his actions. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. The screen lit up with another flood of notifications: text messages from friends, emails from the department, and angry comments on social media. He didn't bother reading them. Instead, he swiped to his missed calls. Among them were a few from his commanding officer and even more from unknown numbers, likely reporters or activists wanting a statement. But one name stood out: Emily, his ex-wife. Sebastian stared at the screen for a long moment before finally dialing her number. The line rang twice before she answered, her voice cautious but firm. "Sebastian." "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I just needed to hear a familiar voice." Emily sighed. "I saw the news," she said softly. "Everyone's seen it." There was a long pause before she continued. "Sebastian, what were you thinking? A child. You know better than this." "I thought I was protecting her," he replied, though even as he said it, the words felt hollow. "I didn't want her to get hurt, but I don't know, it all spiraled so fast." Emily's tone softened slightly, but there was still an edge of frustration. "You've always been good at your job, Sebastian, but you've also always struggled to see beyond the badge. People aren't just suspects or potential threats, they're human beings. And this time, you got it wrong, really wrong." The words stung, but he knew she was right. He had gotten it wrong in the worst way possible. Meanwhile, across the city, Ben Carter sat at his dining table, surrounded by legal documents and stacks of papers. His lawyers had spent the day drafting formal complaints, organizing the community's response, and preparing for a press conference. But at the center of it all was Mia, curled up on the couch with her doll, still clutching it tightly as if it were her lifeline. Ben's heart ached every time he looked at her. She had always been a bright, happy child, full of curiosity and laughter. But now, she was quiet and withdrawn, her eyes shadowed with a fear that no 5-year-old should ever experience. He walked over to her and knelt beside the couch. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently, brushing a stray curl from her face. "How are you feeling?" Mia didn't answer right away. She looked down at her doll, tracing the stitching on its dress with her finger. "Why did the policeman yell at me, Daddy?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did I do something bad?" Ben's chest tightened, a mixture of anger and sorrow welling up inside him. "No, baby," he said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong. That man made a mistake, and it had nothing to do with you. You're smart and kind and brave, and don't you ever forget that." Mia nodded slowly, but her eyes still held a hint of doubt. Ben kissed her forehead and pulled her into a hug, silently vowing to fight with everything he had to ensure this never happened to another child. The next morning, the city was buzzing with activity. Protesters gathered outside the police station, their chants growing louder with each passing hour. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Mia" and "End Police Bias" filled the streets. Community leaders and activists organized peaceful marches, demanding accountability and systemic change. Ben stepped out onto the steps of the youth center, where dozens of reporters had gathered for his press conference. He was dressed sharply but simply, his demeanor calm and resolute. He held Mia's hand as he approached the microphone, the sight of her drawing audible murmurs from the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," Ben began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to my daughter was not just a failure of one officer's judgment, it was a reflection of a deeper problem, one that has plagued communities like ours for far too long." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But this isn't just about pointing fingers, it's about finding solutions. It's about ensuring that our children can play in their neighborhoods without fear. It's about building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And it's about accountability for every officer, every leader, and every system that fails to protect the people it's meant to serve." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ben squeezed Mia's hand gently before continuing. "I'm calling on the police department to conduct a full investigation into this incident and to implement mandatory training on implicit bias for all officers. But more importantly, I'm calling on all of us, parents, neighbors, community leaders, to stand together and demand better, because our children deserve better." The press conference made headlines across the nation. Ben's words struck a chord with people far beyond his city, igniting conversations about policing, bias, and community responsibility. The video of his speech went viral, garnering millions of views and sparking a wave of support for Mia and her family. Back at his apartment, Sebastian watched the press conference in silence. He felt a strange mixture of admiration and shame as he listened to Ben speak. The man had every right to be angry, every right to demand justice, yet he had handled the situation with grace and strength that Sebastian could only envy. For the first time in years, Sebastian allowed himself to reflect deeply, not just on the events of the past few days, but on his entire career. He thought about the neighborhoods he had patrolled, the assumptions he had made, the lines he had crossed in the name of protocol. He thought about the little moments, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt like glaring signs of a larger problem. The truth was undeniable. He had failed, not just as an officer, but as a human being. But as much as the realization weighed on him, it also sparked something else, a desire to change. For years, he had resisted the idea that he might be part of the problem, clinging to the belief that he was one of the good guys. But now he saw the cracks in that narrative, and he knew it was time to confront them. Sebastian picked up his phone and began typing a message. It was a long shot, but he knew it was the right thing to do. After a moment of hesitation, he hit send. The message read, "Mr. Carter, this is Sebastian. I know I've caused you and your daughter pain, and I want to apologize. I'm ready to listen and learn if you're willing to have that conversation." He set the phone down, his heart pounding. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for his career, but for himself. A journey toward redemption. Sebastian sat at his kitchen table, staring at the screen of his phone. His message to Ben Carter had been sent hours ago, but there was no response. The silence gnawed at him, but he couldn't blame Ben for not replying. Why would he? After what had happened, after the pain Sebastian had caused, why should Ben even consider hearing him out? Still, the silence gave him time to think, something he hadn't done deeply in a long time. He thought about his career, the choices he had made, and the subtle but persistent biases that had shaped his decisions. For years, he had told himself he was a good cop, someone who treated everyone fairly and equally. But the events of the past few days had shattered that illusion. Now he saw himself as he truly was, flawed, ignorant, and in desperate need of change. He didn't just want forgiveness. He wanted to understand. He wanted to confront the biases he had ignored for so long, to unlearn the harmful patterns that had guided his actions. But most of all, he wanted to make things right, not just with Ben and Mia, but with the community he had failed. The next day, Sebastian's phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it hesitantly, his heart racing as he saw the message on the screen. "Officer Sebastian, I received your message. I'll agree to meet with you, but this isn't about making you feel better. It's about accountability. If you're ready for that, meet me at the community center tomorrow at 10 a.m. Sebastian exhaled, the weight of the message sinking in. This wasn't going to be easy. But then again, nothing worthwhile ever was. The next morning, Sebastian arrived at the community center, his nerves taut. The building was modest but welcoming, with colorful murals on the walls and children's laughter echoing from inside. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, intimidating atmosphere of the police station, a place that felt alive with hope and purpose. Ben Carter was waiting for him outside, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Sebastian hesitated, then walked toward him, feeling smaller with each step. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice careful and measured. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Ben nodded but didn't offer his hand. "Let's get one thing straight," he said firmly. "This isn't about smoothing things over. This is about addressing the harm you caused and figuring out how you're going to fix it." Sebastian nodded, his throat dry. "I understand." Ben gestured for him to follow, and they walked inside. The walls were lined with photos of smiling children and community events, a testament to the work Ben had done for the neighborhood. In one corner, a group of kids was painting a mural, their faces lit with concentration and joy. Sebastian felt a pang of guilt as he realized Mia could have been one of them, carefree and creative, instead of traumatized by his actions. They sat in a small meeting room, the table between them feeling like a chasm. Ben leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Sebastian's. "Tell me," he said, "why did you really stop my daughter that day? And don't give me the protocol excuse. I want the truth." Sebastian swallowed hard. "Honestly, I didn't stop her because I thought she was in immediate danger," he admitted, his voice low. "I stopped her because I made assumptions about her, about the neighborhood, about what I thought was normal. I let my biases guide me, and I didn't even realize it until it was too late." Ben's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained sharp. "And do you understand what those assumptions did? Not just to my daughter, but to me, to this community." Sebastian nodded. "I do now," he said. "I can't undo what I did, but I want to learn from it. I want to be better, not just for myself, but for the people I'm supposed to serve, and I want to find a way to make things right, if that's even possible." Ben studied him for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. "Words are easy, Officer Sebastian," he said. "What matters is action." Over the next several weeks, Sebastian threw himself into rebuilding trust, not just with Ben, but with the entire community. He attended workshops on racial bias and cultural competence, listening intently as speakers shared their experiences and perspectives. He volunteered at the community center, helping with events and programs that brought kids together in a safe, nurturing environment. It wasn't easy. The first few times he showed up, people were wary of him. Some openly questioned his motives, while others avoided him altogether. But he didn't let that stop him. He understood that trust had to be earned, and he was willing to put in the work. One afternoon, while painting a mural with a group of kids, he noticed Mia watching him from across the room. She still seemed hesitant, but she no longer looked afraid. Slowly, she approached, her doll tucked under her arm. "Hi," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian set down his paintbrush and turned to her, his expression gentle. "Hi, Mia," he said. "How are you?" She shrugged, then held out her doll. "Her arm fell off," she said. "Can you help me fix it?" Sebastian smiled, touched by the simple gesture. "Of course," he said, taking the doll carefully. As he worked to sew the arm back on, Mia watched closely, her curiosity gradually replacing her hesitation. "Why were you so mean to me before?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but direct. Sebastian paused, the question hitting him like a punch to the gut. He looked up at her, his gaze earnest. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "And I'm really sorry. I'm trying to do better now." Mia considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a start. Months later, the viral video that had once threatened to destroy Sebastian's life became part of a larger story, a story of growth, redemption, and change. The community, once divided, began to heal, thanks in large part to Ben's leadership and Sebastian's willingness to confront his own flaws. Sebastian was reinstated on the force, but he wasn't the same officer he had been before. He approached his job with a new perspective, one that prioritized empathy, understanding, and connection. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was committed to the journey. And every time he passed the community center, now adorned with a vibrant mural painted by the kids, including Mia, he was reminded of the lesson he had learned the hard way. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about facing it, learning from it, and doing the work to build a better future. Building bridges. A year had passed since the incident that had forever changed the trajectory of Sebastian's life. The viral video, once a symbol of outrage, was now a memory that lingered in the back of the community's collective consciousness. For Sebastian, however, it wasn't something he could simply forget. It was the cornerstone of his transformation, a reminder of the work he still needed to do. The changes in Sebastian's life had been seismic. He no longer saw himself as just a law enforcement officer, but as a student of the community he served. His reinstatement on the force wasn't handed to him on a silver platter. It came after months of grueling reflection, retraining, and active involvement in rebuilding trust. But even with his badge back, Sebastian knew the journey was far from over. A neighborhood changed. The neighborhood where Mia had been detained had also transformed in the wake of the incident. What had started as anger and protests evolved into conversations, coalitions, and action. Ben Carter, already a pillar of the community, became a prominent voice for reform, not just locally but on a national scale. He organized forums, worked with local officials, and collaborated with law enforcement to develop community policing strategies that prioritized de-escalation and empathy. Sebastian attended every one of these forums. He rarely spoke, choosing instead to listen. At first, his presence was met with skepticism. Residents remembered him as the officer from the video, and many still carried the sting of that day. But over time, his consistent efforts to show up, listen, and learn began to chip away at their distrust. One such forum was held in the youth center's gymnasium. The room was packed with residents, officers, and local leaders. Sebastian sat near the back, taking notes as Ben spoke at the podium. "We're not here to divide," Ben said, his voice firm but inviting. "We're here to unite, to create a system where officers and communities work together. It's not us versus them, it's all of us, building something better." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Sebastian allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could be part of that something better. A bridge between two worlds. The turning point in Sebastian's journey came on a quiet Saturday morning. He was helping with a neighborhood cleanup event, an initiative started by Ben and supported by the local precinct. Children and adults alike worked side by side, picking up trash, planting flowers, and painting over graffiti. The atmosphere was light-hearted, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined interactions between the police and the community. Sebastian found himself assigned to a group of kids painting a new mural on a blank wall. Among them was Mia. She had warmed up to him gradually over the past few months, though she still regarded him with cautious curiosity. Today, however, she seemed more at ease. "Officer Sebastian," Mia said as she carefully painted the outline of a sun, "do you know how to draw flowers?" Sebastian crouched beside her, smiling. "I'm not much of an artist, but I can try. What kind of flower are we making?" "Daisies," she said with a giggle. "They're the easiest." As they painted together, Mia's chatter filled the air, and Sebastian couldn't help but marvel at her resilience. Here was a child who had every reason to fear or hate him, yet she had chosen to give him another chance. It was humbling, and it strengthened his resolve to be the person she, and the community, deserved. By the end of the day, The mural was a vibrant celebration of unity. Daisies, suns, and handprints adorned the wall, along with a bold message in colorful letters: "Together we thrive." A community restored. The mural became a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience and its commitment to moving forward. It was featured in local news segments and even garnered attention from neighboring communities, inspiring similar initiatives elsewhere. But it wasn't just the mural that marked the progress. Real, tangible changes were taking place. The police department, under pressure from the community and bolstered by Ben's advocacy, implemented new policies aimed at reducing bias and promoting transparency. Officers were required to undergo regular training on cultural competency, and community liaisons were appointed to facilitate dialogue between residents and law enforcement. Sebastian volunteered to be one of those liaisons. It was a role that required humility, patience, and a willingness to admit when he didn't have all the answers, qualities he was still learning to embrace. But he found the work rewarding, even when it was challenging. One of his first assignments was to host a community listening session, where residents could voice their concerns directly to the police. The turnout was overwhelming, with people packing the youth center's main hall. Sebastian stood at the front of the room, nervous but determined. A young mother spoke first. "I want to trust the police," she said, her voice wavering. "But it's hard when you feel like your kids aren't safe." Another man chimed in. "We need to see that you care about us, not just as cases or calls, but as people." Sebastian nodded, taking their words to heart. "You're right," he said. "For too long, we've failed to see the humanity in the people we serve. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I promise to do everything I can to be better, and to make sure our department is better, too." The session lasted for hours, but by the end, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the room. It wasn't perfect, and trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, but it was a start. Healing together. One evening, months later, Sebastian found himself sitting on a bench in the park where he had first encountered Mia. The park had been revitalized as part of the neighborhood's efforts, with new playground equipment, fresh landscaping, and benches painted in bright colors. Ben approached and sat beside him, the two men watching as children played nearby. Mia was among them, her laughter ringing out as she chased a group of friends. "She's doing better," Ben said, breaking the silence. "Still has nightmares sometimes, but she's getting there." Sebastian nodded, his chest tightening. "I'm glad," he said softly. "She deserves to feel safe." Ben turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You've come a long way," he said. "But this work isn't about a redemption arc for you. It's about making sure no other kid has to go through what Mia did." "I know," Sebastian replied, "and I'm committed to that for the rest of my life." The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past balanced by the hope of the present. They were unlikely allies, brought together by tragedy, but united by a shared vision for a better future. As the sun set over the park, Sebastian felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't the peace of forgetting. It was the peace of knowing he was finally on the right path. And for the first time, he believed that path could lead somewhere truly meaningful.